Good evening, TEDxUFS. Hey, shine. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here this evening. Thank you so much for having me. After they've fed off your memories, erased the dreams from your eyes, broken the seams of your sanity, and glued what's left together with lies. After the choices and the voices have left you alone, and the silence grows solid, adhering like flesh to your bones. They've always known your spirit's home lay in your gentle sway to light and substance, but jaded mirrors and false prophets have a way of removing you from yourself. You who live with many names. You who walk with a million faces, none can eliminate your pain. Tell your story. Let it nourish you, sustain you, and claim you. Tell your story. Let it feed you, heal you, and release you. Tell your story. Let it twist and remix your shattered heart. Tell your story until your past stops tearing your present apart. Collective memory shapes the soul, the identity of a group of people, whether it is a family or whether it is a nation. And collective memory, especially with regard to a nation, has signposts, important landmarks, signifiers, turning points, events that take place that fundamentally shift the identity of that nation. So in South Africa's case, we can all think of signifiers, 1652, 1820, the discovery of gold on the reef, the 1912 Land Act, 1948. Perspective in the memory game is really power. I'm fascinated by memory because memory is story. So we all know that the pen that writes the story is the pen that ultimately controls perspective, controls the memory, controls the psyche of the people who will be on the receiving end of that memory. And this is powerful because perspective shapes our emotional responses to the story. Perspective decides who is important in the story. Who do we empathize with? Who do we feel sympathy for? Who gets remembered? Who are the victors? Who are the villains? In the collective memory of my family, South African signifiers have played a very important role. I grew up in exile. My father left South Africa in 1968 because of Bantu education. He wanted to study engineering and couldn't do it because he was a young black man. My mother was studying law at TEFLOP in 1976. Her studies were interrupted by the national student riots. They met in America, started a family, boom, voila, here I am. Another important South African signifier, the story of migration. Our story ultimately is a story of movement and borders, identity, how identities move through different space, how borders shape and define space. My family's story has been shaped by migration, like many of our family stories. I had a similar experience to a lot of African children in this country. My parents, students, immigrants living, eking out a life in America, decide to send me to stay with my grandparents in Soweto. Familiar story? You know this story? Yeah, okay. Then I get sent back to the US to go and be with my parents, courtesy of the apartheid government, who decided to not renew my visa because they said I wasn't a citizen. I got a one-way ticket back to America. My earliest memory is of seeing snow and losing my teddy bear in the snow, and a white police officer giving me my teddy bear, and me being terrified of a white police officer, being a kid from Soweto, and thinking that white people come from the snow. My parents did a very good job at explaining the signifiers of South Africa's story to us as children, me and my siblings, me and my sisters. So we understood when we watched the news what was happening in our country. We understood why we had to be in America. We understood why we called South Africa Haye, home, even though we were a million miles away. What my parents could never articulate to us was the excruciating pain that they felt being so far from home. They could never explain to us how it felt for them to watch the state of emergency and see the streets of their home burning. They could never explain to us why there was an emotional silence in our house. It felt like there was a cloud that hung inside our home that nobody could explain, but that we could all feel. And I think this is why I became a writer, to try to give words to that inexplicable force that we lived with for such a long time. And I thought that that force was unique to my family because of my family's experience. But when we came back to South Africa in 1995, I was 16 years old. We began transitioning back years before that when the country was in transition. During that period of time, I realized that this relationship with emotion in my family is not unique. It's something that South Africa is grappling with. We do not have an emotional vocabulary as a nation. We've got two emotions. We've got euphoria, sometimes alcohol-induced euphoria, many times, and we've got rage, violent, blinding rage. In the 1930s, between 1933 and 1939, at the height of the Depression, the global depression, President Franklin Roosevelt in America created a project called the New Deal. Massive, massive public works project employing all kinds of out-of-work professionals across different sectors to try to create work and to develop the country. One of the projects that was created during this time was the Slave Archive, which is now housed at the Smithsonian Museum. You can log online and look at this archive. It's one of the things that fascinates me the most in this world. Out-of-work journalists, storytellers, writers, researchers were sent into the heart of the Deep South to capture stories of the lived experience of slavery from people who had survived it. So, I mean, this is America in the 1930s. This is Jim Crow America, really like the height of apartheid during America's time. Lynchings, black people hanging from trees, gross inequality, and racialized violence. But the state sends people to go and document these very delicate stories from elderly people. Slavery had ended in America in 1865. So people who would have had a lived experience of slavery in the 1930s would have been people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, first-hand stories of what it was like to be a slave. This is what I would like to see us do in South Africa. We need a memory bank. We have massive problems with unemployed youth, out-of-work people with skills, many without skills. We have a memory crisis. The signifiers of our memory as a nation don't accurately reflect the lived experiences of our people. The people who have written into our history, into our national memory, what these signifiers mean, don't look like me. They don't look like my grandmother. They don't look like many of you. So what does that mean? That means that in our national consciousness, there are gaping holes. There are massive pockets of silence. And where there's silence, ultimately, there will be violence. Silence is like a pressure cooker. You put a lid on it, and the steam builds up and builds up and builds up and builds up, and eventually it explodes, and you get a penny sparrow, or you get the Reeds 4, or you get any one of the number of crises that we have experienced in our country post-1994 that pop up on the national consciousness, and everyone wonders, how did that happen? It happened because we don't talk about what has actually happened in this country realistically. There are many untold stories and many untold perspectives, and this feeds into a psychosis that we have as a nation. I think one of the defining characteristics of South African identity at this moment in history is that it chucks everybody out. No one feels like they fully belong. If you're poor and you're black, you feel disenfranchised, you don't belong. If you are white, then your ancestors were colonizers, you don't belong. If you are colored, then you're somewhere in between and you're not represented, you don't belong. If you are an immigrant, you don't belong. If you are Indian, you don't belong. This is a shared experience. And it's something that we can resolve. South Africa, you do not have a name. Things that go unnamed wander through the world not knowing where to look or where to go. In Africa, names are asked for, prayed for. Blood is spilled in the name of naming. Warm red liquid seeping into dust fills the dead with life. Our names are the dead speaking. South Africa, can you hear the song of the dead? The rush of blood spilling daily in your breast. We kill each other for your nameless name's sake, to appease the hungry ghosts who keep asking, where do we look? Where do we go? The dead know more of living than we, the living dead. The way what is unspoken outweighs what is said. The untold tales of walking corpses who see plenty but go unfed. The silent history shouting at the present like electric fences around king-sized beds. South Africa, your aspirations asphyxiate me. I die each day just to live free. Bonded to the lie that I could own any land, or that you could ever build a fence that could hold all of me. The dead have us by the collar. The dead squeeze themselves into our dreams. You think that you belong to yourself. The dead are using your eyes to see. We dress our wounds in costumes like designer aids and branded poverty. Tourists gorge their tears on raw sewage, then drive 10 minutes to sip chai tea. Our corpses are clothed in contradictions. We fashion fictions to feed free market afflictions. We are dancing to a dead rhythm while the dead wait for us to see ourselves in them. South Africa, the dead do not die. They wait for you to stop being afraid, to hear the voices that know where to go and what to do, to sit with these silences and give them names. I would love to see a digital portal where ordinary people's lived experiences of apartheid are housed. A portal where a 12-year-old can take a cell phone that she can use much better than her mother or her grandmother will ever be able to use, and document their stories of apartheid Every story, across color, across class, across experience. I want to hear the story of the 50-year-old man who was an 18-year-old who was forced into conscription and had to blow the heads off of Angolan babies. I want to know what that lived experience was like, because it lives in the psyche of our nation. I want to know the lived experience of the 60-year-old domestic worker who had to leave her children, who's the third generation of domestic workers in her family, who had to leave their children to go and raise somebody else's children. Every story has its place. We have an obligation to create a national identity that is unlike any identity that the world has ever seen, because every part of the planet had a vested interest in ending apartheid. The story of South Africa actually is not that unique. Many places have experienced forms of slavery, colonialism, Jim Crow, apartheid, you name it. Many corners of the planet have it. What no one else had is a global struggle to end apartheid. For some reason, the entire world felt like they could stand up against the injustice that happened here. And that means that their stories are important too. I want to know the stories of the 17-year-olds in New Zealand who stormed the rugby pitch when the South African national team was playing, and they said, this will not happen. This will not happen in our country. This will not happen in our name. For some reason, I feel like God placed me in South Africa and in America for a reason, because they have a lot of the same blessings and a lot of the same demons. The power that America wields in the world, South Africa wields on the continent. And the sense of insularity, that inward-looking nature that we have, is something that America also has. We have an opportunity, we have a responsibility to create an identity that opens out to the rest of the continent and to the rest of the planet like this, because that's what people did for us. And we cannot do that unless we feel a sense of belonging to ourselves. And belonging only happens through narrative. It happens through story. It is delicate work. It is painstaking work. It is emotional work. It's evocative work. But it's something that we can set as an agenda, as a generation. And it can live anywhere. In the digital era, oh my God. I've shared this idea with so many people, and everyone always looks at me like, yeah, that makes sense. And then it goes nowhere. So, Bloemfontein, you're saying the impossible is nothing. I think a memory bank is necessary, and I think a memory bank is definitely possible. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Last year, I was watching a documentary. It was talking about Great Zimbabwe. And German explorers back in I think it was the 1800s, when they came across this great sculpture made by man.
Said it can't be black people that
They
did
said,
this.
that's exactly what they said.
Yeah.
It can't be black people,
Oh,
it's aliens.
Yeah, like the pyramids, right?
Yeah, like the pyramids.
Yeah.
And so, what do you think about the fact that when you actually look at that, when you look at these kinds of things, it obviously shows everybody that, it shows me personally, the importance of us keeping our national memory. Mm-hmm. And don't you think that even in language, the same has to happen? For example, when you look at, I'll give you an example with TEDx.
Yeah.
The reason you find that here, we never have speakers speaking Sesotho, which is actually what I desire.
And why not? Why can't you create that culture?
It's because of one thing. In the TEDx Open Translation project, you find that our people haven't developed our languages enough when it comes to text and things like that for it to be able to translate something that is scientific.
Wow.
So, looking at that and looking at the ideas that you see out there, don't you think that it is important that each and every single person, no matter what color they are, as long as they enter a university, have to learn an African language?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think Afrikaans is an African language.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, completely. I mean, it's a language, again, it's memory, right? So it's a language formed in the mouths of slaves, you know? How it traveled and how it moved and what it was used for is a part of the story of the language, but its origins are part and parcel of us. And the majority of people who speak this language as a first language are black and brown people. So it's us, it's the story of us. If we are going to swear allegiance to these borders, right, that we didn't make, you know, then we have to accept everything that's inside of them. And language, I think, would have to be a driving force behind the memory bank, because there would have to be a deliberate agenda to prioritize African languages, stories in indigenous languages, stories in the most far-flung rural corners of South Africa, stories from people who cannot read or write, because that's the stuff that, I mean, ditagazelo, praise poems, our clan names, our heritage, these are the things that we are in danger of losing. And I mean, when we lose that, like, we're gone. We're gone. And if you can make it live in the digital space, it lives forever.
Yeah, and talking about English, I was also looking at what happens in the British Isles. You find that ancient Gaelic, not a lot of people even speak the language anymore.
Yeah.
It's less than 20,000 people. That's endangered.
Wow.
Yeah, and in Scotland, it's less than 60,000. Understand? And when you look at things like these, you realize that when people look at language and they say we should keep one, it tends to oppress all the others.
It's true.
So that was my ending note on this one.
Last year, my last thing, because I know I've eaten well beyond my 18 minutes. You never stop translating from your mother tongue. If you learn a language as a primary language, whether you learn just to speak it or even just learn how to understand it, your brain, some part of your brain conceptually is always translating for the rest of your life from that language. So to say that, you know, our languages are who we are, we need to understand that at the level of DNA, you know? And if we don't, then we erase ourselves, we erase everything that we are. Thank you.